Welcome to 21C Museum Hotel Cincinnati. It's so nice to see you all here this evening. My name is Alice Gray Stites, and I'm the Chief Curator and Director of Art Programming for 21C Museum Hotels. 21C is North America's first multi-venue museum dedicated solely to the art of the 21st century. We are really thrilled with all of the enthusiasm with which we've been welcomed by Cincinnati's vibrant arts community, and with the exceptional programming that our 21C team in Cincinnati, Eli Miners and Michael Hurst, have put together. So I want to thank them very much for organizing this evening's discussion with George Legrady and Brian Knep. At 21C Cincinnati, we have a number of site-specific projects. These are permanent works that were designed for the building, and also with thinking about this city and about the future. So many of these are interactive works that involve new technologies, like George Legrady's refraction series that is in the hallway in the between the restaurant and the main lobby, and Brian Knep's healing tiles, which are glowing on the floor towards the restrooms downstairs. So I'm just going to briefly introduce them, and we're going to hear from Brian and then from George about their projects, and then hopefully we'll open the floor for some discussion. I just want to mention, we were in Louisville last night for a panel discussion about the intersections of art and architecture in the contemporary world, and much of our conversation veered towards this new intertwining of art and science. We're beginning to ask ourselves, what is contemporary art if it involves all of these other kinds of disciplines and thinking? And this is exactly the way I think about both of their work. I think of one of my favorite books about contemporary art is by Leonard Shlain, and it's called Art and Physics. He said the role of visionary art is not only as an aesthetic that is pleasing to the eye, but this kind of art, visionary art, actually functions as a distant early warning system of the collective thinking of a society, what's to come. This description certainly fits both George and Brian's work, and we're really pleased to have them here tonight. Welcome to 21C. Brian Knep is an artist based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and has served as artist in residence at Harvard Medical School. George Legrady is the chair of the director of the Experimental Visualization Lab at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Welcome, and thank you.
Thanks. Hey, everyone. So thank you so much, Alice, for bringing us here. It's a lot of fun and to see the work. I put the piece up while the building was kind of being built around me, so it's really cool to see it all come together. Whoa, hello, popping. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what brought me to the piece that's here downstairs, and then briefly go through some other work and try to just go really quickly to leave a lot of time for questions.
Just push in the end there, maybe.
This thing?
Yeah.
All right.
There you
go. All right. So I am really drawn to metaphors in science. I'm kind of an armchair scientist, and particularly cycles of birth, growth, and death. And one of the things I'm drawn to is this magic that happens when you get this sort of very complex behavior. These are starlings flocking. This very complex behavior out of simple decisions. So these birds are all kind of trying to stay close to their neighbors, stay away from predators, go towards food, and you get this beautiful behavior. And this kind of thing, you see it all the time here are schooling fish. You can sort of ask yourself, what is the organism here? Is it these individual fish, or is it this school of fish? And humans do this as well, of course. This is the wave. But this is kind of funny. I mean, and in a way, this is a great example. You've got all you need to know about is what your neighbors are doing. As soon as your neighbor stands up, you stand up. It's all you have to do. It's very, very simple, right? But this kind of complex group behavior happens, and it's just a way of looking at complex systems. And I'm drawn to it also because hello.
You can maybe just use
This is
the
a
other
neuron.
mic.
This is a neuron.
Just go ahead and put that one down and grab the other.
Ruined my talk. Anyway, all right, this is a neuron, okay, a brain cell. It's got a complex stuff happening inside. It's got a nucleus and all, right? But all it knows about is its neighbors. I'm sure some of you have had this in biology. And so they signal to each other, okay? You put 1 billion of these together, you get a brain, and you get a sense of self. So how does that happen? It's kind of magical. And scientists talk about these kinds of systems. They call them emergent systems. That complexity emerges out of simplicity. So going back to the neuron, it turns out you can actually describe the way that this fires, right? You've got other neurons that are communicating to it, and they send signals, and when that signal gets high enough, it decides to fire and sort of propagate that signal. Turns out you can actually describe this with a set of pretty simple mathematical equations, okay, 2 equations. If you take those equations and you simulate them on the computer, you get really beautiful things like this. So to me, I'm really drawn to that idea that something very, very simple can create something that's quite organic and lifelike. This is a piece called Healing Pool. You can see, if you've seen the piece downstairs, it's very similar. I've done a lot of works in this vein. This was at the Milwaukee Art Museum, a 30 by 20 foot piece, trying to experiment with how multiple people sort of walk across and wound it. I'm going to show a little video now of it. Hopefully you've seen the piece, but I want you to just notice after somebody wounds it, how it heals itself. So notice that the sides come together, but they never touch. So what's kind of neat about this piece and what drew me to these particular set of algorithms and a lot of this artwork that I created is that once you wound the piece, it heals itself, but never the same way twice. And the way I can describe that often is if you think about zebras, no 2 zebras look alike, but you will always recognize a zebra. Thumbprints or things like that. So these types of systems always have that sort of quality, right, where you can recognize them, but they're never the same twice. So what I love about these pieces in particular is that the state they are in at any given time is the result of everybody who's walked on them since we first turned it on. So it has a bit of a history there. This is another version of the piece I did, which has these sort of meditative areas that you can lie down in. These are some more explorations called flowers. This is flower umbilicus and flower revealed, a little more smaller personal interaction. I'm also very interested in architectural spaces and using existing elements. This is Boston City Hall, which is a giant, ugly, brutalist structure, but it has these beautiful internal spaces. And I started to think about my work as, instead of projecting images, projecting X-ray where I was showing what was already there, some kind of history or blood or life of the building. This is a piece called Drift Wall, and these columns drift upwards, changing, but when you turn the piece on, every column is exactly the same. And when you look at a particular column, that column starts drifting downwards, and because of that brief drifting downwards, it will forever be different from all the other pieces. And I want to emphasize, these aren't video loops, like they're generative art. They're generated all the time from a simple algorithm, which you can sort of talk about as the choreography of the piece. So they're never the same twice. I was lucky enough to get a residency at Harvard, and they gave me some pretty free rein. I decided to do a piece here at what's called Harvard Memorial Hall. This was built in the late 1800s, right after the Civil War, to honor the graduates of Harvard who had fought and died in the Civil War. But it was given by, the money for it was given by a bunch of alumni, and they said you can never, ever honor the graduates from the South who fought for the South. So when you go into the building, you see these beautiful marble slabs with information about all the northern graduates, or the graduates who died for the North. And every 10 to 20 years, somebody says, as an act of reconciliation between the North and the South, why don't we somehow honor the Southern grads? And there's a big discussion, a lot of tempers rise, and usually things stay the same. So I decided to use this to create a piece about unfinished healing. And I'll show a video in a second, but briefly I put information about the Southerners under the floor and covered them with a luminous skin. The names of the Northerners are all up here. Southerners are down here. So you wound it, you open it up, reveal the history, and then it covers itself behind you. And one of the key things I did is, instead of putting the names of the people down there, I put down relationships. So I investigated all the folks and found out if they happen to have a lot of kids, I wrote father. If they happen to have a famous uncle, I wrote nephew. If I couldn't find out anything, I wrote classmate or son, which is pretty obvious, to try to get people to think about what would happen if folks in your own life died, and sort of giving you a direction for thinking about having compassion for folks on the other side of a conflict, is always what I was getting at. So as a result of this residency, I also got to work with Harvard Medical School, and I worked in the research part of the school, so I worked with a lot of hardcore biologists and stuff, and started to get interested in using some of the organisms that they use to understand the world, and trying to connect with them perhaps in different ways, and talk a little bit about acceptance versus control, maybe. So this is Xenopus tropicalis. It's a clawed tree frog from southern Africa, and they study it because it has really cool eggs. I studied it for a couple months. They were really generous. They gave me my own lab and some tools and stuff. And I took thousands of pictures, created a bunch of pieces, and this is one of them called Frog Time. So it's a frog struggling to keep up with time, and he kicks into the future and then melts back into the past. So he's constantly cycling, kicking forward, but also cycling from tadpole to adult, tadpole to adult. The next thing I looked at were Caenorhabditis elegans, which are nematodes. They're everywhere, and they're microscopic worms. So this is a millimeter. I did all these through microscopes, and they're one of the most studied organisms in the world, multicellular organisms in the world. So we know more about it than any other multicellular organism. We've got its genome, we know where all its cells comes from, and it's pretty cool. It's got a rudimentary nervous system. Most of them are females. It has eggs. It has a gut. And I started to make little microscopic sculptures for it. So this is a piece called Avatar. So this is Avatar is a representation of a god in a world. So this is a representation of me in this worm's world. And it's cool to laugh, because this is all very tongue-in-cheek work. Deep, but tongue-in-cheek. So I did a lot of experiments. I did a bunch where I cultivated bacteria from my body. So what they're growing on here, what they're eating, are bacteria from my body. So this sort of idea of how can I have any kind of meaningful conversation with these creatures? So maybe I can't, but maybe recent intimates of my body can. And then I made all these sort of experiments, labyrinths to see if they're interested in mindfulness and meditation. Duets, which are, I would put one worm in here, and to see if they would sort of smell each other, but they couldn't touch what they would do. and various other things. What's kind of interesting about these pieces is that a lot of this shading you see here is all bacteria and fungus that have grown into the pieces, and it gave them this really sort of beautiful, almost like old master feel. The final piece I did was, does anybody recognize these? Yeah, so a woman that Carl Sagan and his wife designed, and they etched it into a gold plate and stuck it on the Pioneer spacecraft and sent it out beyond the solar system. And there's this idea, the idea was that we were, if aliens found it, they could have some understanding of who we were, but the reality is aliens aren't going to find it and they're not going to understand it. So it's really more of an expression of ourselves. And so I shrunk them down to worm size and stuck them in with the worms. So you can see the worms are there. So that's it, thanks, and answer any questions later.
Okay, it's great to be here. I've never been to Cincinnati before, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to show a set of works that are connected in various ways to downstairs, to the piece I have downstairs called Refraction. The first work I want to show is called Blink, and the connection is that we presented this work in Louisville 2009, I think, 2010, on the street in a public display situation. And the work it's called Blink, and it was created in 2006 for an exhibition in Beijing. And what we're seeing here is a set of 68 JPEGs, still images, that I got from a video of a person doing a blink. And then I'm using an algorithm called the Ising mathematical model of, that's what it's called. But what it is it's a 1927 PhD thesis on how magnetic particles like to behave. So magnetic particles are either positive or negative, and they, at certain stable temperatures, they want to be like their neighbors. So if the neighbors are positive, they want to be positive. But under stress of temperature change, they became unstable and flip-flop. They go back and forth. So, so what we're seeing here is there are two stable states. One when the eyes are open, and then the other one when the eyes are closed. And the transition from one to the other is unstable. So think of it as a sine wave. And you can see here how particles are fragile in the boundaries, where they kind of tend to kind of oscillate and change a lot. By the way, this is running in real time, so we're seeing the expression of the software. And then, of course, I programmed in deviance, and every 5 minutes it kind of goes crazy. I'm like, that's what it's doing now. So the deviance is when they're all supposed to be open or closed, but some refuse. Like we can see a couple here. So when I explained this to the Chinese curator in Beijing, they said it's too controversial. So we replaced the blank with an abstract pattern. Just to kind of, because you could, you could instantly kind of take that template and apply it to social and cultural situations. In communities, you have people, you dress a certain way and you behave a certain way, and under stable conditions, things don't change. But when radical interventions happen, then things get destabilized. Okay, so we're looking. We're moving on to the work downstairs. This is called, the piece is called Refraction, and it consists of 8 lenticular panels and a computer animation, and then a 4-channel sound work. We're seeing the installation here in Berlin last September at a gallery called Nature Mort. We kind of broke up the pattern of the placement of the images, but there is a very specific order that I like to present it, but curators tend to reorganize it as, which is fine by me. So here it gives you an idea of how it was situated in the space. Okay. So let's look at the, I originally had a text which I eventually took out, but I think it's a good way to start. So refraction is the change in the direction of a wave when it enters a medium. You know, for instance, when you put a straw in a glass of water, you can see how it kind of bends away. And when I did this work, I was also interested in the idea of hypermnesia, which is memory based on images and being able to remember past experiences which are connected to mentally created images. And I kind of threw these two concepts together for this particular work. And the reason is I was going through negatives, old negatives of mine. My background is a photographer. And I came across an evening event that I photographed in Montreal at the Windsor Hotel, 1973. And it's the Hungarian Ball. And I'll just show you the sequence, the way I've kind of planned this at that time. So I didn't know about these photographs, and I kind of came across it, and is it here? Excuse me, maybe I just closed it. Let's try again. Okay. Try again. So my father was the band leader, and and we're Hungarian, so I was born in Budapest. And so for me, it was an interesting kind of narrative, and I wanted to see what I could make of these 120 pictures that I photographed back in 1973. So I spent some time looking at this work and came up with this structure right here. So I wanted to see if I could turn this into a cinematic narrative. So the project involves eight panels, and there is a sequence. So we have, it starts on the upper left and it kind of goes across. So it's basically the story of the evening. And what we see here is so the first in the group is the people who've attended the event, and the second image is the people who are serving at the event. And so we have, let's look at the sequence. And what I've done here is I've worked with a narrative concept from a linguist called Todorov, who says the most basic story is one where you have three stages. You have a situation, you have some kind of transition, and then you have some kind of outcome. So it's kind of similar to blank. You know, you have stability, movement from stable to unstable, and then something else happens. And when I took these photographs, I didn't have any sense of like an overall plan. I was just looking at images. So the first one is I call it encounter. No, I call it magnetic, but it's about this encounter. The second one is scenes at the bar, and I'm, of course, making a connection here to, I think, Manet's painting of La Folie Bergère, which in my mind was kind of something that I was interested in. A kind of scene here of like something happening, it's kind of more personal encounter on the way that people group themselves. The meal, the cornucopia, the dancing, more of the meal. Lonely girl left at the table. And then the last scene is kind of meal, but departure, I guess. So that was the story of that. So I do have a couple of animations. There's one downstairs called Slice, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to run all of these. I'm doing fine, time-wise. Okay. So what I was interested here, also like in Blink, was the idea of when do we recognize that an image is a photograph, and at what moment does the photographic break down? And so what's going on here is the algorithm simply slices the sections into halves, and it moves them around. So each time that it does this, we'll have a different combination of sequences. And at some point, the slices are so thin that it becomes an abstract image. And then at that stage, what it does is it opens itself up, comes back to being a photograph, but the image is a different one. So Slice will move through all of the eight images, and it looks like it froze. But you can see downstairs. So it's, I'm running these animations on this computer, but it's really meant for much kind of a more powerful computer. So the next animation we're not showing here, but it's a collaborative work with a signal processing engineer and a musical composer. And it's running live as well. And what we're doing here is we're taking that image and we're going through the image with these squares, and we're taking the pixel data and we're doing what's called a fast Fourier transform analysis on it, and it generates the sound. So it's this kind of continuous live composition. So the software first decides how long it's gonna run from 45 seconds, and then it switches to another, what I call chapter, and there's 7 chapters in the sequence. And we have 2 sounds. We have the sound coming from the long vertical thing, and then the sound from the background. And depending on how it filters the image, that generates the sonic combination. So I had this piece running at the Edward Cello Gallery for 3 months, and I was completely amazed because it's fine to kind of look at it for like 5 minutes, but the gallerists managed to live with this on a day-to-day basis, 8 hours a day. There are I'm not going to be able to play the whole thing, but there's some loud moments in it where it just kind of goes a little crazy. We may have one coming up in a minute.
Yeah, we'll wait for them.
So the whole idea came from, we've had a lot of what's called visual music, where images come out of sound. And here I wanted to reverse that. I wanted the image to generate the sound. And so what we're seeing here now is that the software is going through and looking for certain things like faces, like we just saw a decoration up on the ceiling. It's looking for plants, looking for the glasses on the table. So the rules in it are that the more photographic the information, the visual information, the noisier the sound is. and that's because photographic information has a lot of complexity in it, lots of pixels of different tones. The minute we filter it, we put a low-pass filter or high-pass filter, where we reduce the range of tones, then we have a kind of more subtle kind of sound experience. So we'll wait for one more scene, and then I think I'll stop here. And I want to introduce one more and last project. It's going to. No, actually, I'll introduce what's going to open in Toronto next month. These are the. It's going to be another lenticular work, and I'm just going to give you the layout of the sequence of images in the lenticular piece. And so, whereas with refraction, I was using the metaphor of creating a cinematic work, for this particular set, I'm thinking about like the concept album. And let's say all of these 6 images, and it's a little hard to see, but I hope you get the idea. All of these 6 images will be compressed into a lenticular, so as you walk by it, you'll see these 6 different images. And you can see that some of these images are just straight photographs, and then some of them are combinations of the other images. And some of them have, I don't know if you can see, but there's slices that are information. So I saw this as this kind of idea of how does a concept album get put together in the recording studio. And basically you have songs, so each of these images is a song, and then you have for the complex images, you have layers of information, and those could be tracks, like one for the drums, one for the keyboard. And what I'm using here are photographs. When I was 20 years old, I bought a one-way ticket to Paris, and I had $200. And I very quickly realized I had to get out of Europe, and I went to the Middle East. So these are some photographs I took back then. A little hard to see here, but you can. This is the Colosseum, and so, and then images also from Montreal. This is the Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem, and the Palestinian Old City in Jerusalem. You can see scenes of shops. So the idea is to kind of relive or resample this material from back then, street scenes in Jerusalem, and images from Crete of water and sand or pebbles. So the original photographs, which I'm kind of interested in, you won't really get to see them because they'll be just part of this lenticular, but you'll kind of be able to see the movement from one to the other. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. I really want to just open up questions for the audience to engage with Brian and George, but I'll just get it started. I can't decide which question I want to ask first, but I think because I'm trying to limit myself to one, so you all will talk. But both of you have created interactive artworks. How important is that aspect of the work? I mean, do you feel that the viewer walking by the lenticulars, for example, that activation, how important is that to you? And Brian, I know the same question you all can answer or argue together, or whichever way you like.
Sure. Well, for my pieces, it's critical. I mean, because the pieces are about interaction. So and I think that whenever there's interactive elements in a work, it should be some part of it, you know, not just a gizmo or something. But for my works, it really is about you are interacting with the piece. The piece might not want you there, it might be indifferent, but then it has to deal with your interaction, and it does that by trying to heal itself. So it's critical. It's, you know, it's part of it. And the thing that's interesting about the work is that you can really view it two ways. You can be on it, but you can also be off it watching somebody else interact with it, and often that's the much more satisfying experience. Both are valid, but so, you know, by encouraging people to sort of become performers in the piece, they become a part of it actually for other people. And that's definitely something I think about when I create them.
So a lot of the work I did in the 1990s and early 2000s was interactive. So the key thing was that nothing would happen if the public came in and didn't do anything. Nothing would happen. These particular works are slightly different because you can't really interact with Blink and some of these other images. You can, of course, interact with the lenticulars. So with the lenticular work, the key thing is that the public has to move in front of it. So there is that kind of aspect. But I think to a large degree, the interaction, or maybe it's more about interpretation in this particular set of works. I'm interested in the idea of or creating a situation where the viewer is asked to try to make sense of what's in the work and how that works. And of course we do that with non-interactive works as well.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, but with yours in particular, there's this, both of you, there's this kind of intentional loss of control or ceding of control of the interpretation. You want the narrative to open up. And I think it's interesting that we're talking about artwork that's born of the algorithms instead of paint pressure, and, you know, traditional media, but which we think of, you know, as being highly controlled. That the technology is something that gives us control over its result, but you're in fact both making work that seeds the idea of control of what the final image will be. I mean, from a visual standpoint as well as from an interpretive one.
Yeah, I mean, I think I often think about the work more as choreography. That's the way how I at least conceptually I deal with it, where I'm setting the rules in motion. That's my part, and the computer is a dancer, but also the person interacting is a dancer in the piece. But it's a very open kind of choreography that can change. But the choreography is the piece. You know, it's still the final image. Well, the final image is a work as well, but it really is the whole system that is the piece. And if you look at I think we were talking about this last night, that it's the decisions I make about color and speed and you know, how I set up that system that is the sort of where I can inject my poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of works I've done that is really interactive. Pocket full of memories. The public comes in, has to take an object out of their pocket. They have to scan it and describe it. It goes on a large screen. And then the objects try to find each other based on description, semantic description. And so I'm using, we heard before, neural network. I'm using an artificial neural network algorithm. And this opened at the Pompidou, and when the lawyers found out about it, they flipped. Because they said, you mean you're not going to have control over what is going to be featured on the large screen? And I said, you know, don't worry, nothing's going to happen. And of course, on the first day, somebody scanned a nude woman. And so this got all the curators really, you know, we're in France, but it still got the curators really nervous. So the kind of work I was doing back then, which I didn't show today, it involved the public giving something to the work. And once that became part of the work, then I had to have a follow-up, which was to analyze what those contributions were, and then present some kind of a response of, you know, this is what happened in Paris, this is what happened in Taipei and Rotterdam. So I don't know if that.
Yeah.
Maybe I went off track, but so the interactivity, the role of the spectator with this kind of work is crucial, as we're seeing downstairs. Very little happens until the viewer walks into your installation and affects the system.
Yeah. I also like that the piece exists on its own, if no viewer is there. I mean, I have a great video where I've hidden a camera in a gallery and just walked away, and you'll see people interacting with it and then walk away, and the piece just grows, and there's something very beautiful about that. Like, it's got its own motivation, even though nobody's there. It kind of doesn't care. It's not there for you, it's there for itself. And in fact, I did a piece where I tried to distill this idea down. It's called Big Smile, and it's a giant smiley face. I found, like, the old smiley face from I forget who did it. It was a guy actually in Massachusetts somewhere. But it only smiles when no one's looking at it. So, it uses face detection, and it sort of sits there and blinks, and it's all happy, and you look at it, and all of a sudden it's just a flat line. And it's, it's like a very simple piece, but it's that idea that the piece exists on its own, for its own reasons or motivation we can't fathom. Then you come, you do something to it, and it has to react to you. But it has equal footing to you. It's not there for you. And I try to inject that into a lot of my works.
Yeah, there's certainly a nice theme about exploring individual behavior versus group behavior.
Yeah.
What's also true, I mean, Blink is very much about some, conformity versus individuality. Okay, I think we should open up for questions. Yes.
I have a question for Brian. I was really interested in how you talk about your pieces in terms of being wounded and healed. Because you could talk about patterns that are disrupted and regenerated, but you instead use this language that's biological, emotional, and anthropomorphic. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
That's a really good question. So when I first made the pieces, that was really forefront in my mind, sort of wounding and healing, and as a way to, that's kind of what the meaning it had for me in some ways. And I felt like it gave people a way in because the pieces are very playful. I think they work at different levels, and I want people to try to get to the deeper level, and so sometimes the language you use is pretty important. But I think when I look back on those pieces, they're more about just reaction to change, and whatever that change is. So you might have a scar, and that scar, the event that created that scar might be a negative event, but it might become part of your identity. So I think on a sort of more philosophical level, it's more about just change and reaction to change. But I find using the language of wounding, it is evocative, and I think my theory is that it helps people approach it at a deeper level. So I'm conflicted about it, but I still use that. Good.
I had another question for Brian. It's interesting that a lot of your work is sort of like this simulated life. And you talk about them sort of as having their life as their own, and they kind of exist whether there's a viewer or not, and they wound and they heal, and it's sort of this symbiosis that's going on. And I'm wondering how it was like for you, because really ultimately you have the control, and like you said, you set up the rules and you write the programs and that kind of thing. How was your experience working with the nematodes and working with the bacteria and working with actual life that's not predictable and really is on its own? Was that frustrating or rewarding?
It was really frustrating. No, that's a great question. So this fascinating thing where I had this, I didn't want to control them all the time. So I did little silly things, like whenever I put them in a sculpture, I created a little corral for them so they could decide to go into the sculpture or not. I kind of wanted to get away from that control idea, and there was a lot of sort of me investigating what that meant to control these animals. But there were times when I really wanted them to kind of go inside and stay inside, and if you think about it, they've got 200 nerve cells, and all they're trying to do is to kind of find food and mate. Okay, so that's all they're doing 24 hours a day, and they would always find the holes in my mazes and stuff and get out. And I'm sitting there going, like, how do I get them in there, and is it worth doing this work? What the hell am I doing? I need a beer, I'm going to the cafe, and like this thing, all it's doing is trying to get out. And so it's 200 neurons, we're beating my billion neurons every time, It was really, really frustrating. And then what actually happened is I actually walked away from the work for a couple of weeks. I was so frustrated. When I came back, something beautiful had happened, and some of the pieces just started to work, and I got most of my shots came after that, sort of like when I gave up control. And some of the shots, you'll see the worms are outside of the sculptures completely. I don't know if you could notice that, but they were just really beautiful images anyway. So there's some lesson there.
I have a question for George. In one sense, it seems to me like you're working against. If you think that photographs are indexable, right? So and and arguably non-narrative, because they're just showing a moment, right? And they don't convey a narrative unless it's just caption to it. That you're pushing them to be narrative and non-indexical in a way. Does that make sense?
Sure. I think photographs are narrative. So even though there's the moment out of time, and there's a particular kind of organization of visual information that speak to us. You know, if you look at photographs from 100 years ago, there's a different kind of cultural presence. So that by itself, so the moment they were taken in time is a story. But yeah, with this last work, and I'm sorry, there were little pictures and it's very hard to see. Yeah, I'm really trying to compress photographic information into this kind of mass, density of mass, I guess. And I'm trying to see, what can I still get out of it? And if I take 6 images and I squeeze them together into one, that's hard to read. But once they're lenticulars, the elements are present in all of them, so different parts will kind of come forward and kind of fade. So there's going to be a kind of visual story there.
That's it. Are the backstories you told us about where the photos came from, like on your trips, going to be parts of the work or not?
Well, there's going to be a little. Yeah, it's called the show is called On the Road, because I also had Jack Kerouac's book in my pocket, and it's a gallery that in Toronto where the gallerist approached me and said, "Can't you do anything that's not electronic?" Because she was always like nervous about if something went wrong with the complexity of the system. So, but she was interested in. She found the refraction a little too poetic, maybe. So I said, okay, the next set is going to be a very dense. So what I'm trying to point out in this particular case is that there's a conversation that's going on between where the work is going to go, and in this case, this gallery. Last night we talked about site-specific installations. And that what I'm bringing up now is the kind of conversation that actually happens person to person between, let's say, a curator and what you as an artist do. So these are some of I'm bringing out into the open some of the side conversations that kind of led me to kind of go in this direction. But I'm very much interested in my background's photography, and I've been doing a lot of image processing and. So the idea of creating mass, like a density of image, is something that I want to explore.
This is a question for both of you. You both sort of, as your original subject matter, used some form of record keeping or a technology of seeing, whether it was the photograph or the historical record, and then you translated or resaw that through the technologies of today. I'm just wondering, 15 years from now, will you re-see these existing works through the contemporary technology of that day?
Okay, so I kind of blanked out in the middle, so I'm going to answer anyways. Tell me if the answer is appropriate. So last night we were talking about what happens to works that were done 20 years ago or so. And I have this autobiographical interactive installation that talks about me being born in a communist country in Budapest and then moving to Canada and growing up in the counterculture. And I've had to rebuild that project twice. Basically, the technology is so much locked into the moment that when you try to show the work later, you kind of basically have to rebuild it. Does that come close? Maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about, technically, you often have to rewrite these things. It's very tricky. If you're talking about revisiting them to create a new work or sort of, probably not me. It seems more like George's stuff. Like but certainly whatever the technologies of the time, I do like going back and using historical things, like in the Harvard piece. I love doing that kind of thing, and use whatever tools are available, definitely. So.
But there's a lot of data. I mean, data is a key component of the work. Yeah, and that's kind of interesting because we get to record things that in the past we wouldn't. And I was teaching a class with an engineer, and he wanted me to create an interactive work where we would be always recording the behavior of the person who was doing the interacting. So it becomes a kind of study of, engineers like to study and increase efficiency. So it was, the idea was, let's see how the spectator will interact, and we'll measure it. We'll record the behavior, and then we'll be able to see what works, what doesn't work. So and that digital media allows for that kind of working.
Question for Brian. I was curious, like the piece at Harvard, 150 years later, we're still grappling with issues from the Civil War. So I was just curious what the public response, if it swayed anybody in terms of the original mandate that was laid down all those years ago about now.
I don't think so. I mean, the problem is that Harvard's like it's a bunch of fiefdoms, and there's a lot. It's a ship that's very hard to change direction. And I mean, and personally, I wasn't advocating for or against. For me, it was more important to just highlight it. And I did that piece around the time that I think George Bush was elected the second time, and I live in Cambridge, which is a liberal bubble and a liberal bubble and a liberal bubble, and friends of mine were talking about getting guns and killing people because they were so upset. And there's the whole red and blue state thing going on. And if you actually overlap I have a slideshow I do where I look at the red and blue states and the Civil War states, and they're very, very similar. And you talk to historians. There's a great guy named David Goldstein who writes about this, Still Fighting the Civil War. It's an amazing book, and just how it's influenced us. And very alive in the South, more so in the South than in the North, but it full affects us. And anyway, it's something we don't talk about. And so that's what I was trying to get at, and also talk about personal unfinished healing you often have to deal with. So that's what the piece is about. I think that, it got a generally good review. There were some quite angry people who were saying exactly what I didn't mean, which is, I'm being an apologist for the South, and therefore I'm racist, and therefore Harvard is, and we got a couple of those, but in general, people did like it. The problem is that it was only up for 3 weeks. It was a temporary piece. There was a lot of controversy in terms of getting it in there. I spent a lot of time hand-holding, telling them that, in fact, no, I'm not apologizing for the South, I'm not a racist. We had to go through lawyers, and we talked about this last night, that actually the only reason they allowed it was because it was light. And so somehow light is ephemeral, and I wasn't going to argue, But what's nice about that piece is that we got a really good video, and it's lived on since then. And Americans for the Arts actually uses it in a class where they talk about public engagement through public art, and it's created dialogue that way. I've shown the piece in a kind of a homeless version in various places, and there's a new Civil War piece I want to do, and so things have grown from it. What I've learned from that piece is that if I ever do another piece like that, I would like to create a lecture series or something around it, because it had potential and then it died, and I'd like to try to have things roll out of it, and I just was too naive to know that. So
if you do it, you should roll it out here, since we're like right on the border.
I'd love to.
That was one of the reasons that we commissioned Brian to do the Healing Tiles project here, was from hearing about this project at Harvard and a connection to something, to a strand of history that's here as well. So I was going to conclude by pointing out that, of course, for both of you, memory and time plays a strong role in your work. And I was thinking this afternoon about I don't know if you've read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, but he has, I'm fascinated by this idea of the riddle of the experiencing versus the remembering self. So we're mostly remembering selves, right? We're thinking about ourselves in the, we're looking, imagining our future by looking back, in a sense, in the past tense, or ruminating over memories. The experiencing self, apparently, according to Kahneman's a Nobel Prize-winning behavioral psychologist, the actual experiencing self only lasts like 3 seconds or something like that. You're only really in the moment. And I think that certain kinds of really visionary contemporary art can maybe begin to solve this riddle of the experiencing versus remembering self. So I would love to hear your responses to that.
Okay. I'll just talk about refraction.
Yeah.
And on the road. One of the dangers for me doing this work was I'm using photographs I took 40 years ago, and I didn't want it to be nostalgic. So I didn't want it to be. I wanted to know if I could reinvent something that was done 40 years ago, and to kind of transform it and make it contemporary. Memory is something like, I did mention hypermnesia, and I was very much interested in the study of this Russian psychologist in the late 30s who had a patient who would remember by mentally creating a street and placing images on the street. So then when he would be asked like a question, okay, so what happened on this street in like 10 years ago on a certain date, he would be able to play back the cards and kind of give the information. And so so that was a very influential book for me for doing that piece downstairs. And combination of, I'm looking at these pictures I took him 40 years ago. What do I think of him now? Is it real? Is it to what degree is it fictional? So all those kind of questions were in the background as I was kind of constructing that work downstairs.
Yeah, I would say that one of the reasons that I like doing interactive installations rather than a lot of my contemporaries do pieces on, it's a big movement now to do pieces on iPhones and iPads and stuff, and that's great, and I might do some too, but I like doing interactive installations where people have to come in and use their bodies. And I'm sure we've all experienced this, that the technology we use today kind of limits us to this, like our finger and our eyes, and there's a lot of thinking going on, and we kind of, you can spend the whole day in front of the computer and just forget where you are. And so I love creating an environment where people have to come together and do something with their bodies and interact with each other face to face. One of the great things that, because these systems are kind of, I set them up and then I let them go, that often they surprise me. When I first started showing the healing pieces, that one of the cool things that happens is people start mimicking each other. So, someone will dance on it, somebody else will dance on it, somebody will lie down, all of a sudden everybody's lying down. And I came in once and this woman it was raining and she had a black umbrella and she was sitting on the side and she was like using the umbrella to cut individual blobs apart. And then all of a sudden everybody was doing it and they cut them all apart and they were all little, it's just like a bunch of little marbles on the floor, and I'd never seen that. And it was just, and like nobody was talking, they didn't become best friends or anything, but there was this really wonderful sort of group behavior going on, and it was, for me, very satisfying. And if I can get that kind of thing happening in my work, I feel, it feels like successful. We talked about success yesterday too. So getting people together and using their body, being more in the moment, it's always a struggle for all of us. So if I can put that into my work, it's a great thing.
At the same time, actually creating a memory of what happened that will be, embedded within that skin or embedded within our experience. So, any more questions? Yes.
Just a question of curiosity. Everybody knows the general idea of what a painter studio looks like, or a sculptor studio looks like. What does your workspace look like?
That's a good question.
Because I don't know how it's made.
So I have 3 workspaces. This is one of them, right here. And then the one at the university, and it has 3 computers and 6 tables and 3 large projectors and a 6-channel sound system. And I have great PhD engineering grad students, and so they collaborate with me. The studio at home is 2 computers and a wall of books.
And I like George. I mean, most of them on my laptop, and I find that I work in cafes. I live near Harvard, so I use a lot of their buildings, and I have a big studio where I do mock-ups. So once I have to get to the stage where I really need to see what the piece is going to look like. So like Alice saw the piece downstairs. I did the entire piece at 2/3 scale. You know, the projectors were all down at like 8 feet and stuff, and so that was really important. And I have a workbench there, and so I can build things and a bunch of desks and stuff to hang things from the ceilings and all. But I do tend to spend most of my time just on the laptop. So.
Thank you both very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.